Today's experience was sent to us by a sister. She died and saw 3 common sins that takes Christians to hell. This experience will enlighten you more on how to live ready for Christ's second coming. My name is Gwynner Robert. In early August of 2024, I walked into the hospital for what I thought would be a routine procedure, a colonoscopy. It was supposed to be quick and uneventful. I had some worries, as anyone would, but I trusted the process. The doctor explained that an intern would be performing the procedure under supervision, and I agreed. After all, everyone has to learn, right? The morning of the appointment was like any other. When they called my name, I followed a nurse to a sterile room with bright white lights. The intern greeted me with a nervous but polite smile. I noticed their hands shook slightly as they prepared the instruments. I reassured myself that I was in good hands. After all, this was just a colonoscopy, nothing extraordinary, nothing to worry about. The procedure went as planned, or so I thought. I left the hospital feeling a bit sore but relieved that it was over. The rest of the day was uneventful. I went home, cooked a simple dinner, and tried to push the whole experience out of my mind. But within a few days, something started to feel off. At first, it was just a dull discomfort in my abdomen. I brushed it off as part of the recovery process. By the end of the week, though, the discomfort turned into a persistent ache. I began to feel sluggish, like a weight was pressing down on me, draining my energy. I remember sitting on my couch, staring out the window as the days passed, telling myself I'd be fine. It's probably just a flu, I kept thinking. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The ache grew worse, spreading into my lower back and down my legs. My body felt foreign, like it wasn't my own anymore. As August turned into September, things escalated quickly. On September 4th, I woke up drenched in sweat, my head pounding, and my body shaking. My breath came in shallow gasps, and every part of me ached. I thought I might have COVID. I tested negative, but the symptoms didn't stop. Then came the swelling, a sharp, unbearable pain on my right side. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. It only grew worse, and by September 8th, I couldn't take it anymore. I finally dragged myself to the emergency room. By the time I arrived at the emergency room on September 8th, I was barely holding myself together. The pain in my right side was unbearable, and the fever had me drenched in sweat. I could feel my heart racing, my breathing shallow and labored. Every step toward the hospital felt like it might be my last. The ER was bustling, as it always seemed to be, but the staff quickly took me in. After a short evaluation, a doctor informed me that I had cellulitis on my right buttock. It sounded like a manageable issue, an infection that antibiotics could treat. They gave me a prescription, told me to rest, and sent me home. For a moment I felt relief. At least now I had an answer. I started the antibiotics that evening, hoping they would kick in quickly. But by the next morning, things had only worsened. The fever spiked higher, leaving me delirious and shaking. My heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest, racing uncontrollably. Breathing became harder, like there wasn't enough air to fill my lungs. Even sitting upright was exhausting. The swelling on my right side had grown, the pain now a relentless throb that refused to be ignored. I checked my oxygen levels at home, low. My blood pressure? Dangerously low. Everything about my body felt off, like it was spiraling out of control. Still, I convinced myself I just needed time for the antibiotics to work. I tried to rest, but every hour felt like a lifetime and the symptoms kept worsening. 2 days later, I went for a follow-up appointment with my primary doctor. I remember sitting in the waiting room, barely able to hold myself up in the chair. My skin felt clammy, my head spinning, and my chest tight. When the nurse took my vitals, her expression shifted from calm to alarmed. My blood pressure had plummeted to 80/50, and my heart rate was soaring past 150. She rushed out of the room to grab the doctor. Within minutes, they were wheeling me to the ER, which was luckily in the same building. I could barely stay conscious as they rushed me through the halls. By the time I reached the ER, everything seemed to blur together: the beeping of machines, the frantic voices of doctors and nurses, and the cold sting of 4 needles. The diagnosis was grim: severe sepsis. The infection had spread through my bloodstream, and my organs were starting to shut down. My kidneys, heart, and lungs were struggling to keep up. I remember lying on the hospital bed, the world around me fading. The pain and fear were overwhelming, but as everything went black, I felt a strange sense of peace, as if the weight of the world had been lifted. Little did I know, I was teetering on the edge of life and death. As I lay there on the hospital bed, the chaos around me seemed to fade. The voices of the doctors and nurses, the sharp beeping of the monitors, the rush of footsteps, all of it grew distant, like a faint echo in a vast, empty space. My body, so racked with pain and fever moments before, began to feel weightless. Then, everything went black. At first, the darkness was soothing. There was no pain, no fear, no heaviness. It was as though all the burdens I had carried, both physical and emotional, had melted away. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was at peace. I didn't think about where I was or what had happened. I simply existed, floating in a calm, endless void. But the serenity didn't last. Suddenly, I felt myself moving, pulled, as though by an invisible force, deeper into the darkness. It wasn't frightening at first, just unfamiliar. But as I traveled further, the atmosphere began to shift. The air, if you could call it that, grew heavier, oppressive, as if the very space around me was thick with despair. I found myself standing in a realm unlike anything I had ever imagined. It was dark, but not the comforting kind of dark I had felt before. This was a suffocating, pitch-black void broken only by faint glimmers of red and orange in the distance, like dying embers scattered across a vast, endless plain. The first thing I noticed was the sound. It hit me like a wave, an overwhelming cacophony of wailing, crying, and screams. The voices were raw, filled with a pain so profound it seemed to pierce through me. I couldn't see where they were coming from at first, but I could feel their anguish, heavy and all-encompassing. As my eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the embers, I began to make out shapes. Shadows, countless shadows, moving and writhing in torment. These were not just shadows, they were people's souls. Men and women, their forms flickering like fragile flames, all crying out as though their very existence was agony. I stood frozen, unable to move as their cries echoed around me. Each voice seemed to carry its own story, its own sorrow, yet they all blended together into a haunting symphony of suffering. It wasn't just the sound, it was the emotion behind it. It was unbearable, a sorrow so deep it felt like it could shatter the very core of my being. The cries were unbearable, a sound that pierced straight through to my soul. As I stood there, my hand still held by the comforting presence I believed to be my parents, I saw more clearly the forms of the souls around me. They were twisted, contorted in ways that reflected their agony. Their bodies glowed faintly, a dull, flickering light that only made the darkness seem deeper. Men and women of all ages were there. Some crouched, holding themselves as though trying to shield against an invisible force, while others clawed at the air or at themselves, their movements desperate and frantic. Each of them wailed like a newborn, their cries carrying the weight of unimaginable suffering. It wasn't just physical pain, they were crying from a place deep within, as though every regret, every failure, and every sorrow had been magnified 1,000 times over. I tried to look away, but there was no escape. The sound surrounded me, filling every corner of the space. It wasn't just the volume, it was the intensity, the rawness of it. It was the sound of pain that had no end, of souls crying out for relief that would never come. Then I saw demons. They were not like the grotesque monsters of stories or movies. They were shadows with form, their shapes constantly shifting as if they were made of smoke and darkness itself. Their presence was oppressive, suffocating. They moved with purpose, circling the souls like predators. Some stood towering over their victims, others crouched close, their eyes, if they had them, glowing faintly with a cruel, malicious light. The demons didn't merely torment, they seemed to take pleasure in it. They lashed out with claws of shadow, their movements swift and deliberate. Each strike elicited fresh cries from the souls. As I watched, my attention was drawn to a massive gate in the distance. It was ancient, wrought from dark, rusted iron, and inscribed with words that glowed faintly in the dim light, for Christians who strayed from the path. Asterisk. Behind the gate, I could see that the realm was divided into 3 distinct sections, each separated by jagged, uneven walls. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I understood that each section was for a different kind of torment. As I was drawn closer, the first section revealed itself. It was a vast, fiery expanse, the ground glowing with a molten, fiery orange that seemed alive, writhing beneath the feet of the tormented souls. These people knelt in endless rows, their hands clasped in prayer that never reached beyond the choking air. I could see their faces anguished, desperate, their mouths moving in silent pleas. Their prayers were no more than whispers swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. Around them stood demons, their forms tall and menacing. They walked among the kneeling figures, their cruel laughter echoing like thunder. The demons mocked them relentlessly, imitating their prayers with exaggerated tones or twisting their words into blasphemies. Occasionally one would lean in close to a soul, its shadowy fingers brushing against their translucent skin, causing them to flinch and wail. Some souls tried to look away, to block out the torment, but the demons only pressed closer, their forms looming like dark clouds. The heat was suffocating. I could feel it even where I stood, as if the air itself burned with judgment. A voice, low and solemn, revealed to me that these were the souls who had lived hypocritical lives. They had spoken of virtue but acted in ways that betrayed their words. Their faith had been a facade used to mask selfishness or cruelty. Now, their endless prayers were hollow, burned away by the fire of their untruths, and mocked by the very darkness they had hidden within. As I moved forward, I found myself standing at the edge of a vast, shadowy river. Its waters were black as ink, churning and bubbling as if alive. Souls were submerged in its depths, struggling to stay afloat. Their faces would break the surface for a brief moment, gasping for air, before being dragged back under by unseen hands. The river flowed endlessly, its current strong and unyielding. Demons stood along the banks, their forms more menacing here, darker and more solid. They carried long staffs, using them to push the souls back into the water whenever they came too close to the edge. I watched as one soul, a woman, clung desperately to a jagged rock jutting from the riverbed. Her face was etched with terror and desperation as she tried to pull herself out of the current. A demon approached, its hollow eyes fixed on her. With a single, deliberate motion, it jabbed the staff into her side, and she let out a cry of despair before losing her grip and being swallowed by the shadows once more. The voice came again, explaining to me that these were the souls of those who had neglected their faith, not through deliberate malice, but through apathy. They had drifted through life without commitment, neither fully embracing nor rejecting their beliefs. Their indifference had led them to this place, where they now struggled against the very current of their indecision, drowning in the shadows of opportunities they had ignored. The third section was the most haunting. It was a barren, desolate landscape, the ground cracked and dry, stretching endlessly under a sky that seemed to pulse with darkness. Scattered across the terrain were souls, each shackled in heavy chains that glowed faintly like embers. The chains were wrapped around their wrists, ankles, and necks, their weight forcing the souls to stumble and crawl. Demons roamed freely here, their movements calculated and cruel. They carried long, jagged whips made of pure shadow, lashing out at the souls with precise, punishing strikes. With every lash, the chains glowed brighter, burning into the flesh of those who wore them. I watched as a man, his face twisted with regret, tried to rise to his feet. He strained against the chains, but the weight was too much. A demon approached, its whip cracking against the ground, and the man collapsed, his cries of pain echoing in the still air. The voice revealed to me that these were the souls of those who had passed false judgments in life. They had used their faith, their power, or their position to condemn others unfairly, to wield judgment not born of love or justice but of arrogance and malice. Their chains were the weight of their actions, the regret they could not escape, and the torment of knowing they had caused harm without truth or mercy. The next moment came like a jolt, bright, chaotic, and loud. The peace I had felt, the weightlessness of the other realm, was gone in an instant. My eyes flickered open to the sight of faces hovering above me, their expressions tense and focused. I could hear the urgent beeping of monitors and the sharp commands exchanged between the doctors and nurses. My chest burned, my head pounded, and every part of me ached. Yet, through the fog of pain, I could see their determination, their relentless fight to keep me tethered to this world. It was as if they were pulling me out of quicksand, dragging me back to the surface when all I wanted was to sink back into that other place. Please share this message with others. Let them be warned and prepared for what is to come. May God bless you and keep you steadfast in His truth. Let us remain vigilant, discerning, and prayerful in these times. Together we can stand firm against the enemy's schemes.